Airports are meant to be places of transit, of movement, of opportunity. But for some, they become battlegrounds, where authority is twisted into a weapon, and prejudice lurks behind every so-called random check. It's a game played in plain sight, a silent war where those in power push the limits of what they can get away with. Meet Special Agent Amira Vaughn, a highly trained FBI operative, a woman who has spent her career fighting corruption from the inside out. And most importantly, a black woman who has faced the ugly truth of discrimination her entire life. She knows what it feels like to be singled out, humiliated, and underestimated. She has seen how men in uniform use their badges not for justice, but for control. And now she's here to expose them. What happens when a corrupt officer picks the wrong target? When a woman he chooses to harass is not just another passenger, but a federal agent on a secret mission to uncover the very injustice he thrives on. He thinks he's untouchable. He thinks the rules don't apply to him. But he's about to learn a lesson the hard way. This is more than just a story, it's a reckoning. Watch as those who abuse their power fall into their own traps. Stay until the end to witness the ultimate twist that no one saw coming. What would you do if you witnessed this in real life? Have you ever experienced or seen discrimination like this? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that shine a light on the truth. The terminal bustled with hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and the hum of overhead announcements. Travelers, lost in their own world of schedules and destinations, paid little attention to the uniformed officer standing near the security checkpoint. But Officer Randall Grayson wasn't just scanning the crowd. He was hunting for a target. His eyes locked onto a black woman pulling a sleek navy suitcase, her posture relaxed but confident. She wasn't causing a disturbance, wasn't drawing attention to herself. Yet, to him, she fit a certain profile. His jaw tightened. They always act normal, until they don't. Amira Vaughn had traveled enough to recognize the subtle shifts in energy, the way some people's gazes lingered too long, how security personnel occasionally watched her a second too hard. She had learned to ignore it, until it became impossible to. She approached the checkpoint, slipping off her coat, placing her bag on the conveyor belt, and stepping through the body scanner like every other traveler. The machine remained silent. No beeps, no flashing lights. A smooth clearance. Yet, just as she reached for her belongings, a shadow loomed over her. "Ma'am, step aside." The voice was firm, devoid of warmth. She turned to face the source. Officer Randall Grayson, his expression unreadable, but his posture stiff with silent authority. "Random check," he added, though the words felt like an afterthought. Amira's lips pressed together. She glanced around. No one else was being pulled aside. The elderly white couple behind her breezed through security without so much as a second glance. A businessman in a tailored suit walked past, already on his phone, undisturbed. Her pulse slowed, not from fear, but from frustration. She exhaled, kept her voice calm. "I didn't trigger anything." Randall's gaze remained fixed on her, unmoved. "Step aside." The weight of experience settled over her. She knew how this played out. Protest, and she'd be labeled aggressive. Comply, and she'd be humiliated for no reason. The equation never worked in her favor. Swallowing the sharp retort that sat on the edge of her tongue, she lifted her chin and stepped to the side. A few passers-by glanced in her direction, some with mild curiosity, others with an awkward reluctance to acknowledge what was happening. Most ignored it altogether. She wasn't surprised. Indifference was a privilege. Randall gestured toward another officer, who approached with a handheld scanner. He ran it slowly down her arms, her torso, her legs, pausing just long enough to make it uncomfortable. The machine gave no indication of anything suspicious. He exchanged a glance with Randall. "She's clear." Randall's lips barely twitched. "Check the bag." Amira inhaled sharply through her nose, forcing her shoulders to remain still. She watched as they pulled her suitcase off the belt, unzipped it with deliberate slowness. A neatly packed collection of folded clothes, travel essentials, and a laptop lay inside. Randall barely glanced at them. He wasn't searching for anything. He was making a statement. She knew this routine well. The unspoken game of power and degradation. She willed herself to maintain her composure, refusing to let irritation surface. You are not a threat, but they want you to feel like one. Randall finally looked at her directly. Where are you headed? Amira's eyes held his. New York. And what's the purpose of your trip? She gave a tight-lipped smile, though there was no amusement in it. Business. Randall didn't return the expression. His hand hovered over her passport, fingers tapping lightly against the cover before he handed it back. You're clear. Just like that. No explanation. No apology. Nothing to justify the delay, the scrutiny, the quiet humiliation. Amira took a measured breath and reclaimed her bag, ensuring her grip was firm but unhurried. If she rushed, she would look nervous. If she hesitated, she would appear guilty. As she walked away, she didn't miss the way Randall's gaze followed her, as if daring her to react. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Amira gripped the handle of her suitcase, ready to move, but Randall's hand shot out, pressing against the top of the bag. Open it. His voice carried the weight of authority, absolute and unquestionable. Around them, travelers moved freely. No delays, no scrutiny, no unnecessary obstacles. Just her. Her jaw tightened, but she unzipped the suitcase without argument. Randall didn't just inspect, he invaded. He yanked open the lid, rummaging through the neatly folded clothes with unnecessary force, pulling items out and carelessly tossing them aside. A silk blouse crumpled in his grip before being dropped onto the inspection table. A travel-sized toiletries bag was unzipped, contents spilling out. A toothbrush clattering onto the metal surface. A small bottle of lotion rolling away. Another officer, standing nearby, Officer Dave Holloway, raised an eyebrow. That really necessary? His voice was low, but the way Randall barely glanced at him made it clear he wasn't concerned with protocol. Just being thorough, Randall replied, voice laced with mock professionalism. Amira remained still, her fingers curling into her palm. She wouldn't let them see her frustration. That was the game, after all, push her just enough to provoke a reaction, then use it against her. Randall reached deeper, pulling out a zippered pouch. He turned it over in his hand. What's this? My makeup, Amira said flatly. Randall smirked. He unzipped the pouch, turning it upside down. Lipsticks, foundation bottles, and a compact mirror tumbled onto the table. One of the powders cracked, a small cloud of beige dust spilling across the metal. He didn't acknowledge the mess. Instead, he chuckled under his breath. Didn't take you for the high-maintenance type. Holloway shifted uncomfortably but didn't interfere. He had seen this before. He had learned not to get involved. Randall dug further, pulling out a stack of neatly folded undergarments. He lifted one, a lace-trimmed item, between his fingers, raising an eyebrow. Fancy. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he flicked it onto the pile of discarded belongings. A flicker of humiliation passed through Amira, but she gave no reaction. She wouldn't give him that. She stared ahead, expression neutral, even as a few passing travelers shot sideways glances at the scene. Randall finally stepped back, surveying the mess he had created as if it were the natural outcome of a standard search. He made no move to help repack the items, didn't acknowledge the disorder. His work was done. Go ahead and put it back, he said casually. Amira reached for the blouse, smoothing the fabric instinctively before refolding it. As she placed items back into the suitcase, she heard Randall mutter under his breath to Holloway, just loud enough for her to catch. They always act so damn innocent. Until they don't. Holloway said nothing. Amira zipped her bag, adjusted the strap of her coat, and lifted her chin. She had done nothing wrong. She would not be made to feel like she had. Randall watched her, waiting for some flicker of defiance, some small act of resistance that would justify further escalation. When none came, he clicked his tongue in disappointment. You're clear. But it wasn't permission, it was a dismissal. Amira secured the last zipper on her suitcase, fingers pressing down harder than necessary. She wanted nothing more than to be done with this absurd display of power, to step away from the spotlight Randall had forced upon her. But as she reached for her bag, his hand came down on the handle before she could grip it. She froze, lifting her eyes to meet his. The air between them thickened, a silent challenge neither acknowledged aloud. Randall, still smirking, leaned forward slightly. "You in a rush?" His tone was light, almost conversational, but there was something sharp underneath it, something designed to make her feel cornered. Amira inhaled slowly, keeping her expression blank. "I'd like to move on with my day." Randall chuckled under his breath. "See, that's the thing. You don't call the shots here." His fingers drummed against the handle, deliberately casual, as if he wasn't openly detaining her without cause. "You're acting real impatient for someone with nothing to hide." She bit back the urge to say something sharp. This wasn't her first encounter with men like him, men who dangled authority like a weapon, who thrived on making people feel small. Behind her, the line of travelers continued moving seamlessly, a flow of bodies untouched by scrutiny. A young white man, barely 20, strolled through the checkpoint wearing an oversized hoodie and worn-out sneakers. No additional screening, no questions. A middle-aged white woman in business attire walked by, barely acknowledging the officers. No hesitation, no barriers. Amira wasn't surprised. She had seen this before. She had lived this before. Randall finally lifted his hand from the suitcase, but he didn't step aside. Instead, he crossed his arms, posture deliberately obstructive, ensuring that even though she was technically free to go, she wasn't actually free at all. Amira held his gaze. "I assume I can leave now." Randall's smirk deepened. "You assume a lot of things, don't you?" She could feel the weight of the onlookers behind her, the passive interest of strangers who had already decided this wasn't their problem. Some had the decency to look uncomfortable. Most simply ignored it. She wondered if any of them would remember this moment after they boarded their flights, if they would even consider for a second how normal this was for her. Randall took his time stepping aside, making a show of it, like he was doing her a favor. "You're clear," he said at last, his voice thick with condescension. "For now." The words weren't just an end to this interaction, they were a warning. Amira didn't respond. She refused to let him win, refused to give him any satisfaction. She adjusted the strap of her bag, lifted her chin, and walked forward with the same steady stride she had entered with. She didn't need to turn around to know Randall was still watching her. Randall gestured lazily toward the security checkpoint, where other travelers moved freely, unbothered, unchallenged. "You didn't wait for a final clearance." She stared at him, her patience stretching thin. "You said I was clear." He lifted a brow, feigning amusement. "And now I'm saying we need to verify a few things. Unless that's a problem." Amira knew this game. He wanted resistance. He wanted her to push back, to give him an excuse to escalate. She held his gaze, refusing to give him what he wanted. "Fine," she said evenly. Randall's smirk widened, sensing victory in her compliance. He raised a hand, signaling to another officer nearby. Officer Kyle Merrick, taller, bulkier, a man who carried himself like a human barricade, approached. Randall tilted his head toward Amira. "I need a second set of eyes on this one. She's been difficult." Merrick's expression didn't shift, but she caught the flicker of unspoken understanding in his eyes. He knew what was happening. He also knew better than to question it. "Step over here," he said, voice flat. Amira swallowed her frustration and did as instructed. Randall motioned toward her suitcase again. "Open it." She exhaled slowly. "You already searched it." Randall shrugged. "And now we're searching it again, unless you've got something to hide." Her nails dug into her palm. Saying no would mean instant escalation. Saying yes meant enduring further humiliation. Either way, she lost. She set the suitcase down, unzipping it with measured control. Randall didn't bother searching this time. He simply yanked the lid open, letting her belongings spill over the edge. He picked up a folded blouse, examined it as if expecting contraband to materialize, then tossed it aside. Merrick watched silently. Randall pulled out her toiletry bag, unzipping it with unnecessary force. A small bottle of perfume rolled out, landing near her feet. Oops. He didn't pick it up. Neither did Merrick. The implication was clear. She would. Amira bent down, retrieving the bottle with deliberate calm. She would not let them see her crack. Randall leaned in slightly, voice lower now. People like you think you can just walk through places like this without question. That's not how it works. The weight of the moment settled heavy in her chest. She had done nothing wrong. She had followed every order. Yet, here she was. Randall straightened, turning to Merrick. What do you think? She being cooperative? Merrick hesitated. It was barely a second, but Amira caught it. Then he nodded. She's resisting. Randall grinned. That's what I thought. Amira stood motionless, her pulse steady, but her stomach twisting as she watched Randall's smirk widen. He had no intention of letting her go. This was about control, about forcing her into a position where dignity was no longer hers to hold on to. Around her, the airport continued its usual rhythm. Passengers moved through security. Conversations hummed in the distance. The occasional overhead announcement reminded travelers of boarding times. But within this space, between her and the two officers flanking her, time slowed to something unbearable. Randall tapped a finger against his belt. His stance relaxed, but his gaze sharp. Shoes. Jacket. Now. Amira inhaled, kept her expression neutral, and reached down to slip off her flats, the cool airport tile pressing against her bare feet as she straightened. Slowly, methodically, she unbuttoned her blazer, shrugging it off and folding it neatly over her arm before placing it on the inspection table. She refused to let him see hesitation, refused to show even the smallest crack in her composure, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest like a vice. Randall, arms crossed, surveyed her with a lazy amusement that made her skin crawl. He nodded toward Merrick, who stepped forward with a handheld scanner, moving it along her arms, her torso, her legs. The device emitted a faint beep, meaningless in any real context. But Randall seized the moment like a predator pouncing on prey. Well, well, he mused, exchanging a glance with Merrick. Guess we better be thorough. Amira knew there was nothing. No concealed object, no reason for suspicion. The beep could have come from a loose thread, static, an irrelevant anomaly that meant nothing, except when wielded by someone determined to make it mean something. Her stomach tightened as Merrick took a step closer, his presence looming, the weight of unspoken authority pressing against her like a force field she couldn't break. Her arms remained at her sides, her shoulders square, but the moment stretched unbearably as the world around them moved on, indifferent to what was happening in plain sight. Randall's voice was thick with false professionalism. Step aside for a more thorough check. Before she could comply, a voice cut through the moment, firm but not loud. Is that really necessary? The words came from a man standing a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, brows furrowed in quiet disapproval. Late 30s, dressed casually, but well, the kind of man who didn't look like he was used to being ignored. He wasn't shouting, wasn't aggressive, just questioning, as if something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Randall turned slowly, his expression shifting from amusement to thinly veiled annoyance. Sir, this doesn't concern you. The man hesitated, glancing at Amira. It kind of does, he said after a moment. I've been watching, and she's not resisting. So why? Randall stepped forward, his tone lowering to something more dangerous. Unless you want to join her for additional screening, I suggest you move along. A challenge. The man's jaw clenched, but after a pause, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head before taking a step back. Amira watched as he hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, then turned and walked away, shoulders tense with unspoken frustration. Defeat without a fight. Randall turned back to her victorious, the smirk on his face settling into something more smug, more permanent. Now, he said, rolling his shoulders as if the interruption had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Where were we? Randall barely acknowledged the man walking away, his attention fixed solely on Amira. The unspoken message was clear. No one is coming to help you. He gestured lazily to her suitcase, still sitting open on the inspection table, clothes already rumpled from his previous search. You know, I just remembered something, he mused, voice dripping with false concern. We had a report earlier about contraband making its way through security. Would be irresponsible if we didn't double-check, don't you think? Amira's fingers curled slightly, nails pressing into her palm. You already checked my bag. Twice. Randall smirked, ignoring her. He turned to Merrick, who gave a slow, exaggerated nod. Yeah, better make sure. Merrick stepped forward, taking his time as he dug into the suitcase, fingers sifting through her belongings with a deliberate slowness meant to make it clear that this was no longer about procedure. This was about performance. He lifted a folded dress, shook it out as if expecting something to fall from the seams, then crumpled it back down without a care. A book she had packed for the flight was flipped through roughly before being tossed aside. Every movement was meant to prolong the humiliation. Then Randall let out a low whistle, holding up a small plastic bag, a travel-sized pouch of protein powder, one of many common items tucked into her toiletries bag. He held it up between two fingers, turning it slowly, ensuring the surrounding passengers could see. Well, he drawled, feigning surprise. Now, what do we have here? The first murmurs rippled through the nearby travelers, heads subtly turning, eyes flickering toward the unfolding scene. Curiosity first, then judgment. Amira knew what he was doing. He wasn't accusing her outright. He didn't need to. The implication was enough. Randall tilted the pouch toward Merrick, who squinted at it before exhaling through his nose. Could be anything, he said vaguely, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Randall nodded, tapping the bag against his palm. Yeah, could be. Should probably run a test, just to be sure. His eyes flicked toward Amira, waiting for her to react. She refused to take the bait, but others were already reacting for her. A few steps away, a woman clutched her purse a little tighter. A man in business attire shot her a quick glance before looking away, suddenly invested in his phone. Another traveler, a teenage boy, raised his phone subtly, angling it just right. Randall saw it, of course. He turned his head slightly toward the growing group of spectators, then exhaled in mock exasperation before speaking just loud enough for them to hear. You can record all you want, he said, feigning indifference. Won't change a thing. Some people think rules don't apply to them. The words landed exactly as he intended. More cameras came out. More whispers passed between strangers. The weight of their silent judgment pressed down on Amira like a slow, suffocating current. Randall let the silence stretch before chuckling under his breath. Guess we'll just have to see what the lab says. He tossed the pouch onto the inspection table carelessly, as if the damage hadn't already been done. Around them, the quiet hum of the airport continued, but in this small, cordoned-off space, the rules were different. The onlookers whispered, their gazes darting between the officers and Amira, waiting, expecting something to happen. Randall made sure of that. He thrived on it. Merrick shifted beside him, arms crossed, expression unreadable, but his presence alone was enough to solidify the imbalance of power. Two armed officers, one unarmed woman, a growing audience too afraid or indifferent to interfere. It was the perfect setup. Randall finally exhaled, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment. I try to be reasonable, he said, tone edged with condescension. I gave you every opportunity to cooperate. He reached for his radio, pressing a button just long enough for the static to crackle. We've got an uncooperative passenger here. A possible obstruction of security procedures. Amira didn't react. She had nothing to prove, nothing to defend. But that was exactly what made it worse. Randall wanted a reaction. He needed one, and since she wouldn't give it willingly, he'd force it out of her. Merrick took a step forward, the shift in his stance unmistakable. Randall watched Amira closely, searching for any flicker of defiance, any involuntary step back, any subtle movement that could be twisted into resisting. She gave him nothing. He smirked. All right, have it your way. The cuffs were off his belt in an instant, the cold metallic glint catching the harsh airport lights as he reached for her wrist. Turn around. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. The moment was no longer just tense. It was shifting into something else, something final. A voice spoke up. Hey, isn't this a little much? Randall's patience snapped. He turned, eyes locking onto the source of the interruption, a middle-aged woman near the security lane, clutching her purse, brows furrowed. Hesitant concern, not defiance. The kind of concern that came too little, too late. He scoffed, shaking his head. "Ma'am, this is official security protocol. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with the TSA." She hesitated, shifting on her feet, but didn't press further. No one ever did. Randall turned back to Amira. Still no resistance. Still no fear. That was what infuriated him the most. He tightened his grip on the cuffs, lips curling into a smirk as he leaned in slightly. "You can act tough all you want," he murmured, voice low enough that only she could hear. "But tough won't save you now." He snapped the first cuff around her wrist. The crowd murmured louder now, uncertainty lacing the whispers. The phone cameras that had previously been discreet were now fully raised, recording everything, but Randall didn't care. He had played this game before. No one would stop him. No one would question the report he'd file later. The cameras wouldn't change a thing. They never did. He clicked the second cuff into place, stepping back slightly as if admiring his work. His smirk widened. "Now," he drawled, tilting his head mockingly, "who exactly did you think was going to save you?" The moment the cuffs locked around her wrists, Amira knew she had him exactly where she wanted. The metal was cold against her skin, tight enough to be uncomfortable but not unfamiliar. She had worn cuffs before, just never on this side of them. Randall expected her to react, to resist, to panic, to plead. But instead, she merely exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath, her posture shifting in a way that made the air between them heavier. Something about her stillness made Randall's smirk falter for the first time. The usual satisfaction of breaking someone down wasn't there, and that alone should have been his first warning. His grip on her arm was firm, almost bruising, but she didn't pull away, didn't flinch, didn't so much as tense. Instead, she lifted her gaze, looking him dead in the eye, with something that wasn't fear. "Officer Grayson," she said, voice even, almost conversational, "you just made the biggest mistake of your career." Randall scoffed, but it lacked the usual arrogance. His body betrayed him, shifting just slightly as though his instincts sensed something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. He glanced around, noticing for the first time the way the crowd had grown. The casual bystanders had turned into witnesses. More phones were out now, cameras raised high, recording everything. Even his own partner, Merrick, looked uneasy, his stance no longer quite as solid as before. Randall tightened his jaw, trying to reclaim his control of the moment. "Yeah," he shot back, voice sharper than before. "And why is that?" Amira didn't resist. She didn't need to. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable before she slowly raised her cuffed hands, fingers slipping into the inner pocket of her blazer with an ease that came from years of habit. Randall's grip instinctively tensed, but before he could react, she pulled out a small leather case, smooth black with worn edges from use. With a flick of her wrist, she flipped it open. The gold badge caught the light first, metallic and unmistakable, gleaming boldly against the black leather. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Below it, her name, her title, her authority, all of it undeniable. The terminal, once filled with murmurs, fell into something dangerously close to silence. The casual whispers turned into sharp gasps, and somewhere in the distance, someone muttered, "No way." The man who had hesitated earlier let out a stunned, "Oh damn," his phone now fully trained on Randall. The woman who had spoken up earlier took an instinctive step back, eyes wide with realization. Even Merrick stiffened beside him, his jaw clenching, his shoulders squaring, as if he could feel the noose tightening around both of them. Randall just stared. His fingers twitched at his belt, but there was nowhere to go, no move he could make that wouldn't end with his own career shattered beneath his feet. Amira's voice was dangerously calm. "Special Agent Amira Vaughn, FBI," she said, her tone almost polite, but the sharp edge beneath it was unmistakable. She tilted her chin slightly, eyes steady, watching every flicker of realization cross Randall's face. And this entire encounter, she let the weight of the words settle before delivering the final blow. "It's all on record." Randall's breath hitched. He barely noticed the way his grip had slackened. The way his own body had betrayed him before his mind could even catch up. The cameras, the witnesses, everything. The authority he had wielded so carelessly just seconds ago no longer belonged to him. The phones, the murmurs, the eyes, all of it turned against him in an instant. His name, his badge, his power, none of it would protect him now. His mind scrambled for something, anything, that could salvage what little ground he had left, but he had none. He had been playing a game of dominance, a game he had rigged to always win. But the moment those cuffs had clicked shut around Amira Vaughn's wrists, he had lost. Amira lifted her hands slightly, the metal still locked around them, the ultimate proof of his failure. "You want to go ahead and finish arresting me?" she asked, voice laced with something dangerously close to amusement. "Or are you finally realizing just how deep you've buried yourself?" Randall's world was shrinking by the second. The weight of the badge Amira held between her cuffed hands pressed down on him harder than anything he had ever experienced. His mind raced, grasping at any possible way to reverse this, to shift the power dynamic back in his favor. But there was nothing. No escape, no justification, no loophole that would undo what had just happened. The cameras were still rolling, the crowd now fully aware of the spectacle unfolding before them. The same judgment Randall had so easily cast on others was now aimed directly at him. Merrick took a slow step back, his face unreadable, but the way his eyes darted between Amira and Randall said everything. He wasn't about to go down with him. Randall swallowed, trying to steady himself. "This doesn't change anything," he muttered, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. Amira arched her brow, tilting her head slightly. "No," she asked, voice smooth, controlled. "So when Internal Affairs reviews the footage of you unlawfully detaining a federal agent, that's not going to change anything? When my team submits a formal report detailing every civil rights violation you just committed, you think you'll just what? Walk away?" Randall's fingers twitched, but he said nothing. The silence around him was suffocating. A voice crackled through the radio clip to Merrick's belt, and Randall's stomach plummeted. "Control to Unit 4. Stand down immediately. Agents are en route to your location." Randall's breath hitched. Agents. Plural. He barely had time to process the words before movement near the security entrance caught his eye. 4 men and 2 women in dark suits pushed through the checkpoint, badges already raised, expressions cold and unreadable. They moved with purpose, precision, authority. FBI. Not just Amira. A whole team. Randall stiffened. The crowd shifted, murmurs growing louder as the realization spread. This wasn't just a viral video anymore. This was an operation. The lead agent, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, didn't even glance at Randall as he approached. His eyes locked onto Amira first. "Agent Vaughn," he greeted, voice sharp, professional. "Are you all right?" Amira exhaled through her nose, rolling her shoulders slightly. "Better now," she said dryly, lifting her cuffed hands. "Mind getting these off me?" Randall felt his blood run cold. The lead agent's expression darkened. His gaze finally shifted to Randall, the weight of it enough to make his skin prickle. "Unlock her," he ordered, voice leaving no room for argument. Randall hesitated, but only for a second. His hands fumbled at his belt as he yanked out the key, the metal shaking slightly as he reached for Amira's wrists. The cuffs clicked open. She rubbed her wrists absently before crossing her arms, watching him with a look that made his chest tighten with dread. The lead agent didn't give Randall time to recover. "Officer Randall Grayson," he said coolly, "you are now the subject of an official federal investigation into unlawful detainment, racial profiling, and abuse of power. You are to remain on site for questioning." Randall's mouth went dry. Amira's voice was softer, almost sympathetic, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. "I'd advise you not to run," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. "I promise, that won't end well for you." Randall barely breathed as the lead FBI agent continued speaking, the weight of every word sinking into his chest like concrete, dragging him underwater. "You will remain here for formal questioning. Failure to comply will result in immediate detainment." The unspoken, or worse, hung heavy in the air. Randall knew exactly what that meant. If he ran, they'd bring him down harder than he ever had anyone else. His mind scrambled for a way out, but there was none. He had seen men in his position before, panicked, desperate, clinging to authority that no longer belonged to them. He never thought he'd be one of them. Merrick took a slow step back, distancing himself. Randall barely noticed. His ears buzzed with static. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to argue, to deny. But what could he say? The badge pinned to the lead agent's chest said FBI. The phone cameras capturing every angle ensured that this moment would outlive him. The cuffs, still hanging loosely in his hand, felt heavier than ever. Then, before he could process what was happening, one of the agents pulled out a second pair. Officer Grayson. The words were crisp, emotionless, final. Turn around. A lifetime of wielding power, of standing on the other side of this exact exchange, flashed before his eyes. The moments where he tightened cuffs around another person's wrists without hesitation. The times he smirked as he watched fear creep into their expressions. The way he told himself it was just a job. Now, as the agent's firm grip landed on his wrist, yanking his hands behind his back, he understood something he never had before. The ones in control never imagined the cuffs could be for them. The sharp click echoed louder than it should have. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some bystanders who had hesitated before now whispered openly. The same people who had ignored Amira's humiliation just minutes ago now held their phones even higher. They weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing. Amira stood still, arms crossed, gaze steady as she watched the scene unfold. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She had already won. When Randall finally forced himself to meet her eyes, he expected anger, satisfaction, revenge. But what he saw was worse. She didn't see him as a threat anymore. She barely saw him at all. The agent tightened the cuffs, securing them in place. Randall Grayson, you are under investigation for unlawful detainment, excessive force, and civil rights violations. You will be escorted for immediate questioning. Randall's mouth went dry. A voice, soft but razor-sharp, cut through the moment. You were right about one thing, officer. Amira stepped closer, just enough for him to hear. There are people who don't belong here. She let the words settle before tilting her head slightly, a small, knowing smile ghosting over her lips. And today that person is you. Randall's breath hitched. The agents turned him away from the crowd, leading him through the checkpoint, past the same scanners he had once controlled. Every step felt like a march toward something he couldn't escape. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping narratives like this. What was the most shocking moment for you? Do you think Randall got what he deserved, or should the punishment have been even harsher? Let us know in the comments. Also, where are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you.